338 BCE, the state of Qin. A man is arrested. The charge is treason. The laws used to prosecute him, he wrote them. His name was Shang Yang. And by the legal code he designed, there was no way out. The new king ordered his execution. His family was exterminated. He died, but the code kept running. A little more than a century later, that code helped Qin unify China for the first time. That is the puzzle at the center of this episode. Kill the programmer. The operating system keeps running. Not just keeps running, it becomes part of the institutional foundation that later Chinese dynasties would inherit, rebuild, and patch for more than 2,000 years. So the question is, how was that operating system first written? The answer is not in the Qin Empire. The answer is in the 250 years that came before it. The Warring States period, 475 to 221 BCE, was not simply a time of disorder. It was one of the most brutal governance stress tests in early world history. 7 major states, running parallel experiments in real time, under conditions that were not theoretical. No laboratory, no margin for failure, no option to pause. If your governance worked, your state survived. If it didn't, your army was defeated, your land absorbed, your people registered into a rival's machine. That was the testing environment. And out of that environment, one approach proved more scalable than the rest. We often picture the 100 schools of thought as a golden age. Philosophers traveling between courts, rulers weighing competing ideas, a rare moment of intellectual openness in Chinese history. But in the Warring States, thought was not an opinion. Thought was a survival tool. These ideas were not shallow. Each of them was trying to answer the same fundamental question. After order collapses, how do you rebuild civilization? But if an idea couldn't answer the pressures of war, it was unlikely to become the core of any state's governance. The real question rulers were asking was not which philosophy is most beautiful. It was, which one keeps my state alive through the next war? Think of it in system terms. Every governance approach had to pass 5 tests. 1. Can it mobilize resources, food, tax, soldiers at scale? 2. Can it expand from one county to a much larger territory without breaking? 3. Can it push commands through local power structures? 4. Can it hold internal order under military pressure? 5. Can it keep running after the founder dies? Those were the real acceptance criteria. And Warring States China provided something rare in early history. 7 major states running different governance experiments in parallel, under real war conditions with real consequences. Beautiful theory was not enough. It had to mobilize, execute, scale, and keep running after its founder died. Let's be clear about something first. The question is not which school of thought was more ethical, more enlightened, or closer to the truth. The question is which approach proved most deployable under warring states conditions. Confucianism. Confucian thought was sophisticated. It recognized that social order depends on internalized moral commitment, not just coercion. Educate people to care about their families, their communities, their rulers. Build civilization from the inside out. But this created a problem of speed and standardization. You can cultivate a morally serious person through years of education. You cannot mass-produce one before the next war arrives. Confucianism was not incapable of governance. It became the dominant language of Chinese statecraft after the Warring States. But in the immediate lethal competition of the period, it was difficult to deploy at scale, fast. Daoism. Daoist thought saw the danger of over-intervention. The more the state pushes, the more it disrupts natural order. Govern less, interfere less, let the system breathe. But Warring States China was not an environment that allowed recovery. If your rival was mobilizing every resource for war, and your principle was minimal interference, you were losing a race you didn't realize you'd entered. Early Han emperors later applied Taoist-influenced governance after decades of war. It worked, because the war was over. The warring states never offered that pause. Mohism was more practical than it gets credit for. Tight organizational discipline, sophisticated defensive engineering, a coherent ethics of non-aggression. But it got stuck on tests 2 and 5, scalability and long-term automatic operation. Its ethics required people to extend equal care beyond their immediate relationships, to treat strangers as family. As personal philosophy, admirable. As the incentive logic for a large state machine, it asked more of human nature than a system could reliably deliver. Legalism. Legalism started from a colder assumption. Confucianism wanted people to become good. Legalism assumed they wouldn't, and redesigned the reward structure accordingly. You don't need officials to be virtuous. You need them to know the cost of breaking the rules. You don't need soldiers to believe in the cause. You need them to know that battlefield results earn rank. You don't need farmers to love the state. You just need the returns on farming to exceed the returns on anything else. It mobilized resources. It scaled administration. It pushed commands through local power. It held order under war, and it could survive its founder. That system passed all 5 tests. Legalism did not win because it was humane. It won because it was scalable. Thought alone doesn't become a state machine. Legalism needed a translator. In 356 BCE, that translator arrived. His name was Shang Yang. With the backing of Duke Xiao of Qin, he rewrote the state, not in theory, but in institutional modules. Module 1, rewrite the incentive structure. Under the old feudal order, land and people were bound up in noble estates and clan obligations. Shang Yang connected farmers more directly to the state. Farming, tax, and military service were now measured and rewarded by the state. Your status was no longer only a function of bloodline. Module 2, military merit, 20 ranks. 1 primary path to advancement, battlefield performance. It didn't matter who your father was. What mattered was the result. The system didn't need you to believe in it. It only needed you to respond to incentives. Module 3, standardized local administration. Local governance was tied to centrally appointed officials, rather than hereditary nobles. The same administrative logic could be replicated across counties. The system became copyable. Module 4, mutual surveillance. Groups of 5 and 10 households held each other accountable. Failing to report a violation made you liable for it. The village became its own enforcement node. 4 modules. 1 design principle. Remove reliance on individual virtue. Replace it with measurable reward and punishment. When a state becomes scalable, individuals become measurable. Farmers become production figures. Soldiers become battlefield metrics. Officials become compliance data. People remain in the system, just as quantifiable units. Then in 338 BCE, Duke Xiao died. Political enemies moved against Shang Yang. He was arrested, under the laws he had written, executed, his family exterminated. But the core logic remained. A truly robust system keeps running after its creator dies. In 221 BCE, Qin unified China. The stress test was over, but a new problem emerged. The competing versions hadn't disappeared. Confucian texts still praised the feudal order Qin had dismantled. Historical records from the 6 kingdoms still supported narratives of restoration. As long as those alternative source codes circulated, they could become the language of rebellion. The response, proposed by Chancellor Li Si, burn them, not all books. Medical, agricultural, and technical texts were preserved, but private copies of history, philosophy, and competing political thought destroyed. And then, according to traditional accounts, hundreds of scholars were executed. The exact identities and circumstances remain debated by historians, but the broader pattern of imperial suppression was real. This was two things at once. A system locking its version, deleting competing code before it could be used to reboot an alternative OS. And a cultural atrocity, real people, real books, real futures extinguished. The system logic explains the decision. It does not justify it. Then, 15 years later, Qin collapsed. The Qin dynasty failed. But the Qin code survived. Han inherited the counties, the census, the bureaucracy, and much of the administrative logic beneath them. Then it wrapped the whole system in a Confucian interface. At roughly the same time, on the other side of the world, another civilization was running its own stress test. The Greek city-states, same era, the same pattern of fragmentation, interstate competition, intense political experimentation, but a different geography and a different testing environment. Mountains and coastline cut the Greek world into fragments. Large-scale political integration was expensive to build and difficult to hold. The city-state, small, autonomous, self-governing, became the dominant unit. This is not about Greeks being naturally free and Chinese people being naturally obedient. That framing is wrong. It is about different structural pressures producing different optimization targets. In the warring states, continuous land warfare rewarded states that could register households, tax grain, conscript soldiers, and integrate conquered territory. Greek philosophy often entered the academy, the public square, the civic debate. Warring states thought applied more directly for a job inside the state machine. Greece helped compile a language of citizenship, debate, and political philosophy. Warring states China helped compile a language of bureaucracy, unification, and state capacity. Both traditions built something lasting. Both carried costs forward. But before we draw any modern conclusions, explaining the origin of an operating system does not excuse its modern behavior. History is not an alibi. Han had classical scholarship. Tang had Buddhist philosophy. Song had Neo-Confucianism. Ming and Qing had evidential learning and practical statecraft. China kept producing thinkers. What it didn't reproduce was the testing environment. The warring states was one of the few periods in early Chinese history where ideas could directly compete to become a state's governance architecture. Where a school of thought could be adopted by a real government, stress-tested under real war, and either survive or collapse on that basis. After unification, that competitive interface closed. Thinkers could still operate inside the imperial OS, interpret the classics, advise rulers, propose reforms, but very few were in a position to propose replacing the OS itself. Under the imperial framework, most thinkers were writing plugins, not competing to replace the kernel. Much of China's later strength, and many of its later constraints, came from this shift, from multi-version competition to a single imperial framework. But here is something important. Qin's system did not run unchanged for 2,000 years. It ran more like a kernel, a core that later dynasties kept patching, reframing, and rebuilding on top of. Han did not delete the Qin kernel. It installed a Confucian user interface on top of it. The counties, the census, the bureaucracy remained, but power now had to explain itself in the language of moral order and dynastic legitimacy. Tang refined the administrative architecture. 3 departments, 6 ministries, a more layered decision structure, and a civil examination system gaining institutional weight. That module we examined in detail in the previous episode. Song faced a different problem, regional military commanders breaking central authority. Its solution was systematic civilianization. Separate military, financial, and administrative power at the local level. A more civilian empire, and facing powerful northern rivals, a more strategically constrained one. Each dynasty patched a different bug. Each patch introduced new ones. The underlying problem never changed. How do you keep a vast civilization governable? Every version kept asking the same question. If you look at how modern China governs, you'll notice a familiar pattern. not because today's China is deliberately imitating the warring states, but because certain institutional reflexes, visible in how that ancient stress test sorted for winners, seem to have persisted. Local pilots, central feedback, selective scaling. China's policy innovation often begins not with a national rollout, but with a pilot, a province, a special economic zone, a city. If it works, it scales. If it doesn't, it stops or gets quietly archived. Shenzhen was not a replay of Shang Yang's reforms, but structurally it followed a similar logic. Authorize a peripheral zone to operate under different rules, observe the results, and scale what works. This is a structural analogy, not a claim that the same system has been running unchanged for 2,000 years. The COVID response also showed this mechanism at work and revealed its risks. Local implementation, rapid coordination, fast replication. The system could learn quickly, but fast learning under a single metric can also mean fast amplification of costs. Signals that don't fit the optimization target tend to arrive late or not at all. In the warring states, the feedback loop was survival. Today, the feedback loop is a modern state apparatus: central targets, performance metrics, expert systems, political judgment. The mechanism has changed. The underlying logic is recognizable. Before the conclusion, 4 things this episode is not saying. First, this is not historical determinism. Path dependence is not destiny. It means certain choices are structurally cheaper to make and others more expensive. Any institutional grammar can be rewritten. The question is always, at what cost and borne by whom? Second, modern China is not simply a legalist state. It is layers of code stacked over centuries. Marxism-Leninism, revolutionary party structure, nationalism, planned economy, market reform, technocracy, global integration. Legalism is one old layer among many. It is not the whole system. Third, policy pilots are not uniquely Chinese. Federal systems, the European Union, many democracies run local experiments. The structural difference is not whether you experiment. It's who defines success, who reads the results, and whether those readings can be contested. Fourth, this episode is not defending authoritarian efficiency. Efficiency is not legitimacy. A system can be highly effective at scaling decisions, including wrong ones. Without external correction mechanisms, the most dangerous errors tend to be the ones that look most aligned with the optimization target. Which brings us to the question this episode can't answer for you. The warring states stress test was extremely good at selecting for one thing: governance that could mobilize, scale, and survive. It was not designed to answer a different question. Should those be the highest priorities? If scalability is the optimization target, which forms of inefficiency are worth preserving? If central coordination defines the feedback loop, what happens to signals the center doesn't want to read? If stability and unification are the highest values, where does individual experience sit in the priority stack? These are not questions unique to China. Any system that passes a large-scale stress test tends to canonize the very qualities that helped it win. The real challenge for any successful OS is learning when not to scale, when to hear voices outside the system. We began with a dead man, 338 BCE, Shang Yang, arrested under his own laws, executed, and a system that kept running without him. A little over a century later, Qin unified China. 15 years after that, Qin collapsed, but the code survived. Understanding China requires more than memorizing dynasties. You have to look at the code underneath. Emperors die, dynasties fall, policies change. What matters is which questions the system keeps asking and which answers it keeps selecting. If you want to keep following that question, subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.